Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker. Proud of it. Today I'm going to talk about something that I haven't really talked much about before, and that is these protests going on in the Islamic world against these cartoons that were published in Denmark. There's a reason why, instead of my usual beautiful backgrounds, which are usually pristine snow scenes or grassy hamlets or something like that. Today I have the Sistine Chapel. And although I'm covering up most of Adam over here, the other fellow, who I'm kind of semi-pointing to over here with the beard, represents God. And not only does he represent God, it's a pictorial image of God. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because that is forbidden in the entire Islamic world. Beautiful piece of work like that, which is represents probably the highest religious feeling, Renaissance art, one of the most beautiful pictures there could be. And what is it? It's forbidden. And that's basically what this whole controversy is all about. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it or haven't heard about it, and I'm sure there are many, because let's face it, we live in America. They live in an entire Islamic world, 5,000 or 10,000 miles away. There have been riots. Embassies have been torn down over it. Embassies have been burned up. People have been killed in riots over what? In the 17th of September, there was an article in the Danish newspaper that said that there were artists that were afraid to portray their art for a book about the Prophet Muhammad because of threats from extreme Islamists. And why is that? There's, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert, I am a history buff, however, is that there's nothing actually in the Quran that says you cannot picture Muhammad or God. However, it is a tradition that to portray Muhammad and Muhammad's picture is a form of idolatry, and it was forbidden in the early caliphate because they were afraid that they would raise Muhammad to a position of a Messiah or a Mahdi, and that wasn't the intention of Islam. The intention of Islam originally was to declare that there's only one God, and that there is one God of all, and that God is great, and that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So idolatry is completely forbidden. And as a result, throughout history, as that rule became more and more absolute, and people made absolute opinions about what that meant, it got to the point where not only was Muhammad's own image not forbidden, but the image, and God's image was forbidden, but the image of all people were forbidden for a long time. And that's why if you see a lot of magnificent Islamic art, if you go to the museums, and you'll see beautiful calligraphy, and you'll see geometric shapes, but you'll very, very rarely see, except for the Persians, with that one exception, a lot of people being pictured in Islamic art. And that basically is because of this forbidding of portraying people in pictures or statues as a form of idolatry. And I put up this picture here just to show that, hey, this is the West. This is Western culture. This is Renaissance art. And in Renaissance art, we don't have a problem with picturing the deity. We don't have a problem with picturing the Messiah. We don't have a problem with picturing the prophets, and they do in the Islamic world. So basically, I hope that I don't get protests or anything, because I'm violating at least custom, if not Sharia law, by actually picturing in the form of Michelangelo's beautiful rendition of God and Adam creating the world, picture of the deity. And that's what this is. Can't get around it. So I don't know whether I'm in front of Abraham properly. I think I mean Adam rather. I think I am. But here is the rendition in art, and in, of course, great art, which is, I can't say for myself or my show, a beautiful rendition of the deity. So there you are, and there you have it. So what happened over here? We've had burnings of embassies in Beirut, Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, demonstrations all over the Islamic world, demonstrations in Europe by Muslims, and what was it of? They were, on September 30th, 12 pictures, which were really editorial cartoons, were written. Each one had the image of Muhammad. The one that seemed to have hit home the worst was Muhammad with a turban on his head, but the turban was shaped like a bomb with a fuse coming out the back. This was absolutely upset the, let me find the name of the organization, the European Committee for Honoring the Prophet, which was a coalition of 28 Muslim organizations, and among them were the Danish Muslims Association. I don't have the name of that particular one. And it was headed by a guy named Ahmed Akari. So he went to the newspaper, and he didn't get any satisfaction. He went to the government, and he demanded that the newspaper be tried for blasphemy. Doesn't change that. I mean, that is absolutely what they were demanding. And of course, there's a separation of church and state in Denmark. This group went to 10 countries' ambassadors, demanded that the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mr. Rasmussen, meet with these 10 people, 10 ambassadors. And of course, the cultural problem came in. The Danish ambassador said, look, first of all, my country doesn't have to apologize for what appears in a newspaper that's a private newspaper. If you want an apology, you should get it from them. So he wouldn't meet with the ambassadors. There were demonstrations, up to 5,000 people on the streets of Copenhagen, 5,000 Muslims, and they didn't get satisfaction. So what did they do? Well, I kind of wish this is not what they did, but this is what they did. They went, first of all, they put together a dossier. Now, the dossier not only included the 12 cartoons that were published, but 3 absolutely horrible cartoons that were added that they claimed were sent to Muslims, some radical group sent to certain Muslims. But they weren't things that were published. But those went into the dossier. Then they went on a road trip throughout the Middle East in order to get fatwas from the authorities, the Islamic authorities in the Middle East, in order to determine whether this was blasphemy. Well, blasphemy or not, again, Denmark is not an Islamic country. It's not under Islamic law. And while it is wrong to offend another group, and I agree with that, and those other 3 pictures that they threw in to inflame people certainly made it worse. It's still, where's the law on the books in various countries against blasphemy? And especially against blaspheming the prophet. So apparently that doesn't exist. I don't believe it does, and at least in Denmark, and it does in the rest of Europe too. Now, Norway threw in, and it wasn't the Norwegian government again. It was a Norwegian newspaper called Magazinet reprinted the cartoons. And eventually they were reprinted in France and many other countries. I think a total of 10 other countries throughout the world. And of course, we've been real careful not to do that because we don't want to offend. We have troops in the Islamic world, and there are riots in Afghanistan, which has been, compared to Iraq, relatively tame front, in which I think it's up to 7 or 8 people have been killed already. So it's definitely not a good idea. But is it blasphemy? And does it justify the kind of overreaction that we've had over here in the Islamic world? So what happened next? Well, he went to a number of people. He went to the foreign minister of Egypt, Mr. Gate. And Egypt is a pretty moderate country, at least as far as we can tell. They have a peace treaty with Israel. They have relationships with the Western world. So what's this about? Obviously, when they looked at those extra 3 as well as the 12 pictures, they were outraged. But moreover, it went to the #1 actual Islamic scholar, or the highest authority among Islamic scholars in the entire world, and that is the head of the head of the university. I think it's I don't have the name of it here, in Egypt, and Al-Azhar, I believe, and asked him what was his opinion, and of course he declared that that was outright blasphemy. And I'm sure if it had appeared in a newspaper or had been sponsored by a government in the Islamic world or in the Arab world, it would have been blasphemy, and there would have been hell to pay over it. Now, a French paper, Le Soir, also reprinted it, and the editor of that paper was fired because the guy who owned that particular newspaper was a Frenchman of Egyptian background, and fired him on the spot. So for insulting the Prophet. Now, the key point is the third person that Mr. Akari went to and his group went to, and that was Abu Musa, the head of the Arab League. Right after that, or not too long after that, Saudi Arabia, and this has actually happened in January 26th, it's almost a month ago, 3-4 weeks ago, initiated a boycott of all Danish goods. Now, Danish goods are EU goods. You either reject them all or you accept them all. And no other, at least Europeans, have to buy anything from any European nation, can't do that. But of course, this is Saudi Arabia, so the question is, of course, a lot of things say made in Denmark, but others say made in the European Union. So how do they know that there's really Danish goods? But what was a little bit worse is that once this thing got going, and once this thing got serious, and once the boycott got serious, that some of the big chain stores, one is called Carrefour, which is a French chain. I've actually been in them in France, and a couple other companies who were building big stores in the Middle East, they started to boycott Danish goods in response to the government. They're in response to their customers. Of course, their other customers in Europe were horrified at this, and there's been an official protest by the head of, by the Prime Minister of Denmark. So this is not only causing problems between the Arab world and the Western world, which is exactly what the Islamist radicals want, but it's causing tremendous problems throughout Europe, between the European countries. So what else happened? On the 31st of January, on the 30th of January, the newspaper printed an apology, and it was basically kind of a watered-down apology. They apologized for the pictures that it might offend somebody, but they didn't apologize for publishing them. They basically said, we have a right to publish these, but we do apologize that you're offended. This was rejected by that group, who then continued to go around and hype this issue and really go after Denmark throughout the whole entire Islamic world. That's resulted in what's happening now. The Weekly Jordanian, a Jordanian paper, published the cartoons, but the publisher was immediately fired and King Abdullah, the king of Jordan, apologized that this happened, immediately shut it down. The International Association of Muslim Scholars called for a day of anger in, of all places, Palestine, Gaza, Palestine. 50,000 people demonstrated. And in Europe, in London, protesters called for the execution of those that insult Islam. South African court prohibited the publication of the cartoons there. They're not an Islamic country, but they do have a minority of Muslims, mostly from Pakistan. So they didn't want that kind of trouble over there either. And but things really started getting bad once February came in. The protesters in Syria attacked the Danish embassy, burned it down. Editors of another Jordanian weekly were actually arrested, charged with insulting religion. So definitely in the Islamic world, blasphemy is a crime. You can be arrested even in the most moderate Islamic country. Protesters in Beirut, Lebanon, some say there were Syrians in the crowd who were pushing them to do it, set fire to the Danish embassy. And then the Iranians started jumping into the loop because they've been very extreme lately. They removed their ambassador to Denmark. 5 people were killed on February 6th, protests in Afghanistan. 3 more killed in Afghanistan. And protesters in Iran on the 7th attacked the Danish embassy. And February 8th, 3 more people killed in Afghanistan. And of course, now it's I am actually doing this on Friday the 10th. Of course, the earliest you'll be able to see this is Sunday. And for all we know, maybe it'll kind of calm down by then, or maybe it will have gotten worse. It's hard to say. But the point is, and I'm just going to make this point, that yes, we have different religions. It's never a good idea to go insulting somebody of another religion, and I'm completely against that. However, we have our culture, they have their culture. We don't expect in the Islamic world to actually show a picture of the deity. However, they shouldn't riot when we in the Western world, especially a picture that is in a church, and not only a church, but a church that that is in the Vatican, where the leader of that particular church speaks to 1 billion people and still doesn't have a problem with up on its walls, drawn directly by Michelangelo, one of the greatest artists in the world, has the gall to actually picture the deity. That's not considered idolatry in the Western world. That's considered to be art. And we consider this to be art. And we consider free expression to be important. And clearly, and I'm just going to say it, and I hope nobody will be offended, the Islamic world does not consider free expression to be important and to be a value. So there you are. So what we've been trying since 9/11 so hard to do, which is to keep a clash of civilizations from occurring, has now occurred. And this might be just a minor incident, but it might be something that's major, because it's really basic to what the West stands for versus what the Islamic world stands for. Now, I've mentioned on this show that I was stationed in Europe for a number of years, and I was there while the Islamic movement and the radicals were building up in Europe. And the Europeans, I will tell you, people don't realize it or think about it, are getting pretty alarmed. I was there when Theo van Gogh, descendant of Vincent van Gogh, the artist, was murdered because he pictured something slightly offensive in a movie. And he was murdered while he was riding his bike. He was thrown down by an Islamic radical and who stabbed him to death and put a note on his body in the blood saying that I am doing this because you have offended our faith. So there's no doubt about it. The Europeans are starting to wonder, are we going to be able to absorb this group, and what do they want? Now, there were some groups, the worst of which is the Finsbury Mosque over in London. Al-Masri, the imam of that mosque, has just been convicted in England for preaching hate and murdering infidels or non-Muslims in the name of Islam. So it's become pretty serious over there. They actually arrested that guy. And France has really done quite an amazing thing when you think about it. Now, in Europe, we have a complete separation of church and states. The Europeans talk about it, but they don't have it. So if you go to school in Germany or if you go to school in France, your kids actually take time off from public school and are sent to catechism if they're Catholic, or to whatever the equivalent is if you're a Protestant. And there's a number of religions, and those religions are supported by taxes. They ask you, are you Catholic or Protestant? And then they sign you up to pay a tax to your church. So that is now, the French have applied that to Islam. And what they've done is they've said, they gave it a number of years, they organized 3 Islamic official French Islams, one for the Moroccans, one for the Algerians, and one for the other Muslims, and basically said, look, we are going to support the mosques, we're going to pay for the mosques out of taxes, and in return, here is the curriculum, and here is what you're allowed to teach, and all those imams who come from outside of France who refuse to accept this are going to be deported. And this process finally came to a fruition this particular year, and ironically, this is the year in France that there were riots from one end to the other. Everybody insisted, had nothing to do with religion. They were just young toughs who were upset because they're unemployed. But to be very honest with you, I don't buy that for $1. In fact, if you do buy it, I'll be happy to ask you for $1 because you'll probably give it to me. But the Europeans are concerned, and the other European countries are looking at this French model and saying, maybe this is what we have to do. Maybe we need a European Islam that is truly moderate, and if it's not moderate, or if their members are not moderate, we'll throw them out if they're not citizens. And if they are citizens, we'll arrest them and jail them for inciting terrorism and inciting hatred, which is what they did with Al-Masri, who is the imam of the Finsbury Mosque in London. Now, by the way, this was the imam for Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and for Elias Moussaoui, who is the guy over at who's on trial now for being the 20th hijacker, the 20th 9/11 hijacker. So that's basically where they're at. So this particular issue coming to the fore, and probably one of the most moderate countries in all of Europe, is going to have an impact not only on the Middle East, where within a week or two or a couple of weeks, the next outrage is going to be outraging them. But in Europe, this is going to stick because this is a series of events of basically intolerance by a minority against the values of the majority. And to be very honest with you, the Europeans are worried about it, and they're also, because Islam is still a tiny minority of just 2 or 3% of the population, they're tired of it. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal employee, and I'm proud of it. And this will probably be on Sunday. Might be on again on Tuesday. Please watch. Thank you very much. Appreciate your watching.